you must know that there is a test that is even more important than fasting glucose. There is a measure in our body that gives us an even better understanding of how healthy we are, and it's not glucose. Hello angels, and welcome to the Glucose Goddess Show. I'm Jessie Truspé, I'm a biochemist obsessed with helping you feel your absolute best. And in this episode, we're going to cover a very important topic of what blood tests to order to measure your glucose health, to measure your insulin resistance, to measure how your body is doing internally. So let's get to it. Glucose is your body's favorite source of energy. And when everything is going well and you have an adequate amount of glucose, your body is thriving. If you have too much glucose in your body, or if you have something called insulin resistance, or prediabetes, or type 2 diabetes, then problems are going to start happening. Now, the issue is most of us don't know whether we're internally healthy or not until it's too late. So these are the blood tests to run, or to ask your doctor to run, so that you can detect any issues early enough to act on them. The first important test, you've actually probably already had it measured. It is your fasting glucose level. And generally your doctor is going to order this about once a year because it's the most standard measure of your glucose health. Unfortunately, it's very incomplete, and we'll get to that in a second, but it's still important to mention. So your fasting glucose measures how much blood sugar or glucose there is in your bloodstream, obviously, first thing in the morning when you are fasted. And why does this test happen when you're fasted? Simply because after sleeping for a long time, after fasting for a long time, your body has got the time to bring your glucose levels back down to their baseline. So if you were to measure your glucose levels after a meal, for example, they would be up and down and doing lots of stuff. When we're fasted, generally they're pretty stable, and they give us a good indication of where our baseline is. So your fasting glucose, the number is going to come back something between probably 80 and 150. And the standard guidelines are that if your fasting glucose is underneath 100 milligrams per deciliter, so underneath 100, then you are healthy and there's nothing to worry about. If you are between 100 and 126, then that's considered pre-diabetes. And above 126, that is considered type 2 diabetes. Now, this is in milligrams per deciliter units. If you're in a country like Australia, the UK, Canada, Switzerland, the numbers are going to be a bit different. It's like the difference between, kilos and pounds, different unit systems. In those countries, your fasting glucose level will come back as a number between 4 and 7-ish, okay? And in those countries, millimole per liter, normal is anything under 5.5 millimole per liter. Going forward in this episode, I'm going to focus on the milligrams per deciliter measurements. And if you want a nice, easy conversion table, there's a free PDF in the description of this episode that contains the conversion, but also everything I'm going to touch on in this episode, the blood test to run, the ranges that you should aim for, what they mean, etc. So if you want to have this all recapped in a nice, easy page, head to that link in the description. So interestingly, even though your doctor might say that anything under 100 is totally normal, early studies are showing us that underneath 100 might not actually be optimal. There's a really interesting study that came out that is called Fasting Blood Glucose, an underestimated risk factor for cardiovascular health. Results from a 22-year follow-up of healthy, non-diabetic men. And in this study, they found that more than half of the participants over this 22-year follow-up died of cardiovascular disease, so heart disease, which is unfortunately incredibly common. And that if the men had a fasting glucose level above 85, okay, then they had a much higher risk of dying of cardiovascular disease, regardless of their age, whether they smoked or not, or any other of their heart disease biomarkers. So a few of these studies have popped up showing us that actually, maybe our objective for fasting glucose level should be somewhere under 85 milligrams per deciliter. Now that's considered to be the optimal range. So under 100 is normal, average. Under 85 is optimal. And for the little story, so I've had a long journey with my fasting glucose level metrics, my insulin metrics that I'll cover in a bit. And when I was 23 years old, my doctor measured my fasting glucose level, and the result was 94 milligrams per deciliter. Then 2 years later, it was 96 milligrams per deciliter. And unfortunately, as is too often the case these days, my doctor didn't say anything. My doctor didn't say, hey, Jessie, your fasting glucose level seems to be increasing and getting towards that 100 milligram per deciliter cutoff, where technically you'll be pre-diabetic. So maybe you should look at what you're eating and try to get that number down. No, they didn't say anything. And again, today, way too often, a doctor will not say anything until you become pre-diabetic. So if your fasting glucose level is between 85 and 100, don't just sit there. Think, okay, how could I get that number to be in the optimal range so it doesn't keep creeping up? Because unfortunately, as we age, that fasting glucose level tends to just creep up if we don't change anything. So have a look at my hacks, also linked in the description, which are a really good place to start to get that number down. And if you have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, same thing applies. You can get that fasting glucose level back down with my hacks so that you're no longer pre-diabetic or have type 2 diabetes. It's completely feasible, and many of my readers do it on a weekly basis. And I was able to do it as well. With my hacks, I went from 96 to 87 milligrams per deciliter, which is where I am right now. Of course, it's not yet 85, but I'm pretty happy with this result, considering that just a few years ago, I was at 96. Fasting glucose level, 100% a test that you should ask your doctor to do, and probably you already have those results. So go have a look if you have those numbers somewhere and compare them to these ranges to see where you fall. Now, another test that you should probably order and have a look at is called the HbA1c test. It sounds really complicated, but let me explain what it is. It looks at how much glucose has been circulating in your body over the past 2 to 3 months. So you might wonder, how on earth is a blood test measuring something that's been happening over 2 to 3 months? Well, it does so with a really interesting concept. If you've seen my other videos, you've learned that one of the consequences of having a lot of glucose in our body is that this process called glycation happens more and more. Glycation is like what happens to a chicken that you put in the oven. It goes from pink to brown. It cooks in the oven, and that cooking process is glycation. Now, interestingly, glycation is like aging. And as human beings, from the moment we're born, we slowly glycate, we slowly age, and we slowly cook on the inside. I know it sounds weird, but it's true. And then when we're fully cooked, we die. I know, it's grim. But even though we cannot stop this glycation process from happening inside our bodies, we can slow it down or speed it up. And the more glucose spikes and the more glucose we have in our body, the faster this process happens, the faster we age and the faster we glycate. Essentially, the way it works is that glucose molecules in your body will bump in to lots of other random molecules, and they will damage them. And in that process, they do what's called glycating them. So glucose glycates other molecules. And that's why glucose and glycation actually sound kind of like the same word, because they're very related. And the HbA1c test measures how many red blood cells have been glycated. And as such, gives us a good estimation of how much glucose has been circulating in your body for the last 2 to 3 months. Okay, so in terms of the ranges, and by the way, HbA1c is something you'd be more familiar with if you have type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes. The ranges, underneath 5.7% is considered normal for HbA1c terms. Between 5.7 and 6.4 is considered prediabetes, and above 6.5% is considered diabetes. So measure your HbA1c, make sure it is below 5.7%. And again, if it is too high, it's not an issue. If you use my hacks, you'll be able to reduce how much glucose is circulating and slowly lower your HbA1c, which is going to help you as you age be healthier instead of having your health deteriorate more and more. Hey, really quickly, if you want to study your glucose levels and feel better than you currently do, but you don't really know where to start and you don't want it to be complicated because you're very busy, well, my recipe club has got your back. Monthly, super easy recipes to keep your glucose levels steady, to keep your cravings low, and to keep your motivation super high because it's fun and new every month. Check out the link in the description. Okay, back to the episode. You must know that there is a test that is even more important than fasting glucose. There is a measure in our body that gives us an even better understanding of how healthy we are. And it's not glucose. It is fasting insulin levels. Okay, so why is that the case and what to do? Well, first of all, I need to explain to you what insulin actually does. So every time there's a glucose spike in your body because you just ate carbs, your body asks your pancreas, your organ, the pancreas, to send out a hormone called insulin. Insulin's job, she's awesome, is she grabs all the excess glucose that is circulating around in the bloodstream causing havoc, and she stores the excess glucose into your liver, into your muscles, and into your fat cells. So insulin disposes of excess glucose in the body, and in the process helps us reduce any big glucose spike we just experienced from a meal. So insulin is incredibly useful and powerful. So why do we need to measure insulin to look at our health levels? Okay, let me give you an example. When I was a student, I first studied mathematics in London. I discovered coffee. I had never had coffee before in my life, and one of my friends was like, "You've never had coffee? Try it, it's amazing, you're gonna feel so awake." So I have my first coffee. And of course, let me tell you, I could not sleep that night. I was wired. I was like, whoa, this stuff is so strong. Holy hell, wow, 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 wow. So that was my first coffee. Fast forward 3 months, I need like 3 coffees a day just to wake up and stay awake. So what is that about? How did I go from a situation where 1 coffee made me feel so much, and then I needed 3 coffees to get that same effect, or even actually to get less of an effect? I had become gradually resistant to caffeine. My body had gotten so used to it that it was just not sensitive to it anymore, and I needed to give it more and more caffeine to get the same effect. This is habituation, it's called. And the same thing happens in your body with insulin. So over time, as insulin keeps rushing into your body to take that excess glucose and store it away, your cells become less sensitive to insulin. And your pancreas has to produce more and more insulin to get the same glucose lowering effect as before. You, as a human, then become gradually resistant to insulin. And this resistance to insulin, which is called, as the name indicates, insulin resistance, is a very important measure of health. Insulin resistance is essentially on a spectrum. If you are not insulin resistant at all, then you're super healthy. Then as you get more and more insulin resistant, that turns into prediabetes, and then into type 2 diabetes. The more insulin resistant you are, the harder it is going to be for your body to keep your glucose levels in the healthy range. So your body's going to pump out more and more insulin, but because you're more and more resistant to it, your glucose levels are going to keep rising and rising and rising and rising. But what's really interesting here is that if you measure your fasting insulin level, bear in mind, this is a test that most doctors do not order, so you really have to ask for it. It is incredibly crucial in helping you determine how healthy your metabolism is, because fasting insulin levels start increasing years before your fasting glucose levels increase. Have a look at this graph. As you can see, for a few years, fasting glucose level is normal, but fasting insulin levels start to rise. And only after several years of this situation do your fasting glucose levels also start to rise. So if you measure your fasting insulin level, you will get a much better idea of what actually is going on. Because you could have a totally optimal glucose level, but your insulin level could already be pretty high, indicating that you are on your way to seeing your glucose levels slowly increase and inch towards prediabetes. So, in terms of the range that you want your fasting insulin level to be in, the optimal range for fasting insulin is 2 to 6 microunits per milliliter. A normal level is 6 to 10 microunits per milliliter, and anything above 10 microunits per milliliter can indicate prediabetes or diabetes. So 100% get your fasting insulin levels checked. This is by far the most important test to measure how far along this spectrum you are on and whether or not you need to take action to get that number down. So we went over fasting glucose, which is great but not very complete, but very well known. HbA1c, usually reserved to people with type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes, but still a really interesting test. And fasting insulin, which is by far the most important test to do, but most doctors do not order it. So you have to ask your doctor for it. And you can show them this evidence that I'm linking in the PDF to explain why it's so important to measure fasting insulin, so that we can detect problems early on and work on prevention, not just be reactive once we have a prediabetes diagnosis. And if you do have a prediabetes or a type 2 diabetes diagnosis, your fasting insulin level is going to be high because, as I explained, fasting insulin rises before fasting glucose rises. And as you put your type 2 diabetes or prediabetes into remission, using as support my hacks, your fasting insulin is also going to go down. Now, one last test I want to cover is a very specific measure of how far along the insulin resistance spectrum you are. And it actually combines fasting insulin and fasting glucose into a number that gives you a really precise idea of whether or not you have insulin resistance. This is super important because up to 47% of the population is already insulin resistant. And insulin resistance is not just problematic for the development of type 2 diabetes. It also increases your risk of having cognitive decline or of having hormonal issues like polycystic ovarian syndrome. It's very, very common and it can cause a lot of issues. But thankfully, we can measure it and we can act on it. So the last thing I want to cover is the HOMA-IR ratio. So the HOMA-IR ratio, and I put this all in the PDF linked in the description. Don't worry, you don't have to remember this formula. So to measure your HOMA-IR ratio, you have to multiply fasting glucose times fasting insulin divided by 405 if you are in milligrams per deciliter units, and divided by 22.5 if you are in millimoles per liter unit. Okay? And the result of this ratio is as follows. If your HOMA-IR ratio is less than 2, then you have good optimal insulin sensitivity. You're not insulin resistant. If your HOMA-IR ratio result is between 2 and 3, then that indicates early insulin resistance. And if it's above 3, that indicates significant insulin resistance. So you want to try to get that ratio to be underneath 2. Let me give you an example. If you have a fasting glucose level of 87 and fasting insulin level of 6, and here we are in milligrams per deciliter, you would do 87 times 6 divided by 405, which is 1.288 rounded to 1.3, meaning you have optimal insulin sensitivity. So this ratio gives you a much better understanding of exactly how well your body is able to manage insulin and dispose of glucose, and how far along that insulin resistance spectrum you are. Again, everything here is in the free PDF linked in the description of this episode. I know that's lots and lots of numbers, but just to recap, fasting glucose good, HbA1c good, fasting insulin super important, and then measure the HOMA-IR ratio to really get the final word, a really good sense on your insulin sensitivity and how much you need to be worrying about getting that glucose level down, getting that fasting insulin level down, and how close you are to prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. And finally, I want to cover the case in which you might have a continuous glucose monitor as somebody who does not have diabetes. I don't recommend everybody wear one, but if you're very curious and you want to get some information on this, when you're wearing a continuous glucose monitor, the most important thing is not so much to look at your absolute numbers, so the exact numbers on the app on the screen. What's more important, because those can be quite inaccurate actually, like very inaccurate. Like one time, a glucose monitor told me that my baseline glucose was 105, so pre-diabetic, for 2 weeks straight. And I was so freaked out. I went to the doctor to get a proper lab test done, and it came back 87 milligrams per deciliter. So don't look at the absolute value on the CGM. It's not accurate. What you want to look at, on the other hand, is the variation you see. So if you do not have diabetes, you should try to prevent your glucose levels from increasing by more than 30 milligrams per deciliter after a meal. You don't want things to go too high up, because the bigger the spike after a meal, the more consequences on your inflammation, on your glycation, on your hormones, on your insulin release. So let's say that your CGM indicates that before eating you are at 90 milligrams per deciliter. Again, the absolute number we don't really care about, it's just as an example. Well, after eating, you want to make sure that number doesn't go more than 120 milligrams per deciliter. That 30 milligram per deciliter cutoff for what's considered an optimal glucose increase after a meal comes from a few studies done in people without diabetes. Notably one that I'll mention here: continuous glucose profiles in healthy subjects under everyday life conditions and after different meals. This is a good study that shows us that 30 milligrams per deciliter cutoff is a good one to have. Okay, but in conclusion, if you measure all of these tests at your doctor's and you see that any of them are coming back suboptimal, it is in your best interest to try to get those numbers down. So what I would recommend is work with your doctor, tell them your plan, use my super easy science-backed food hacks, and measure again in a month and see how well you're progressing. I have hundreds of people on a monthly basis who reduce their fasting glucose levels, reverse the type 2 diabetes, get their HOMA-IR ratio down by using my 10 hacks. I'm gonna cite a few here, but if you want them all, I've also linked them for free in the description of this episode for you. So the top ones are: have a savory breakfast, not a sweet one. Add a veggie starter to your lunch and your dinner. Put some clothing on your carbs. Use your muscles for 10 minutes after eating. Have a vinegar drink, etc. They're all linked in the PDF in the description of this episode. I hope that helped. I hope that you're going to go to your doctor's office and ask for these tests so that you can really get a good sense about what's happening in your body and how you can improve it. So that's all we have time for today. Thank you for being here. I'll see you next time.